The voicemail came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning while I was checking the gutters on my place in Barrie. My daughter-in-law's voice, flat, efficient, like she was leaving a note for the dry cleaner. "Hi, just a heads up. The HELOC payment is due Friday, and we're a bit short this month. Can you transfer 2,000? Thanks." That was it. No "how are you doing?" No name, just the ask, hanging in the air like she'd done it 100 times before. She had. I stood on the ladder for a moment longer than I needed to, looking out over the backyard my late wife Pauline had planted 20 years ago. The crabble trees she put in when our son was still in diapers. I thought about calling my brother Gordon right then, but I didn't. I climbed down, went inside, made a coffee, and stared at my phone for a long time. Then I called my son instead. He didn't answer. That was 6 months ago. And if you're wondering how we got to a point where my son's wife called me the way you'd call a payday loan company, let me take you back a bit. Because this didn't start 6 months ago. This started the day I decided that loving my son meant never letting him struggle. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a branch manager at a credit union in Barrie, Ontario. I know money. I know interest rates, amortization schedules, the difference between an asset and a liability. I taught seminars to first-time homebuyers about not overextending themselves. I was good at my job. And then I went home and completely ignored everything I knew. My son's name is Warren. He's 34. He's a good-looking kid. Got his mother's eyes, her easy smile. Pauline passed 8 years ago from a stroke, and after that it was just the two of us for a while. Warren was 26, just starting out. I told myself I was helping him get on his feet. 1 month of rent here, a car repair there, covering his phone bill, buying groceries when he came by. Small things. It felt like being a father. Then he met Cassandra. I'll be honest with you, I didn't dislike her at first. She was sharp, well-dressed, had strong opinions about everything from real estate to which grocery stores were worth going to. She worked in marketing. She had the kind of confidence that can look like competence from a distance. They moved in together about a year after they started dating, into a rental near Yonge and Eglinton in Toronto. 2-bedroom, 1,200 square feet. Nice building. It ran about $3,200 a month. Warren was doing freelance IT work at the time, good when the contracts came in, thin when they didn't. Cassandra was between jobs. She always seemed to be between jobs, transitioning from one thing to the next, which somehow never quite landed. I fronted 2 months of their rent when they first moved in, just to help them get settled. That's what I told myself. The 2 months became a standing arrangement. Not all of it, mind you. I wasn't paying the full rent, but I was contributing $1,500, $1,800, sometimes $2,000 every single month. When I gently suggest that maybe Warren should look for a staff position instead of freelance, Cassandra would say something about how the freelance market was going through a transition, and it wasn't the right time to lock in. When I suggested she look at administrative work while she figured out her next move, there was a long pause, and Warren would change the subject. I had a decent retirement savings. I owned my house outright in Barrie. I'd paid off the mortgage 4 years before Pauline died. I also had a small rental property, a duplex on Essa Road, that I'd bought in 2009, which brought in about $2,800 a month between both units. Modest by Toronto standards. Very comfortable by mine. My brother Gordon, he's 67, retired teacher, lives up near Collingwood. He told me twice in those first 2 years that I was making a mistake. "You're not helping him, Doug," he said. "We were having beer on his porch one August. You're making it so he doesn't have to try." I told him he didn't understand the cost of living in Toronto. He said he understood it fine and that Warren and Cassandra both had functioning arms and legs. I should have listened. But I didn't, because Pauline wasn't there, and Warren was the only person in the world who still laughed at the same things she used to laugh at. He had her laugh, exactly her laugh, and I couldn't stand the idea of him struggling. So I kept paying. Then, about 3 years into their relationship, Warren called me on a Sunday afternoon. He sounded different on the phone, excited, nervous, that particular combination young men get when they've made a decision and they're not completely sure of it yet. "Dad, I've got some news." I thought Cassandra was pregnant. We're thinking about buying a place. The condo market in Toronto was doing what it always does. They'd found a 2-bedroom unit in Etobicoke, $689,000. They needed help with the down payment. I gave them $80,000. I want to be clear about something. I gave it freely. Nobody twisted my arm. I sat in my kitchen in Barrie, looked at my retirement accounts, looked at the equity in my duplex, and I made a transfer. I told myself it was an investment in my son's future. I told myself Pauline would have done the same thing. Gordon didn't speak to me about it for 3 weeks. They bought the unit. Warren got a contract that lasted almost a year, which was the longest run of stability I'd seen from him since his mid-20s. Things seemed okay for a while. I visited a few times. Cassandra kept the place nice. She had an eye for that kind of thing. The throw pillows, the specific coffee brand, the art on the walls that somehow cost $800 apiece, but was described as an investment. Then the contract ended, and we were back. The HELOC they'd taken out against the condo had become a kind of secondary account. When the month was tight, and it was tight often, they drew on it. When they drew on it, the minimum payments climbed. When the minimum payments climbed, they called me. Not Warren, Cassandra. She was the one who called. Always Cassandra. Warren would text sometimes, almost apologetically, a day or two later. "Hey, Dad, did you get Cassie's message?" Like he was relaying information from a manager. Over time, I noticed something. I was invited for dinners on the schedule that roughly aligned with when money was needed. Christmas, sure. Easter, sometimes. But there'd be a run of 2, 3 months where I barely heard from them, and then a dinner invite would come, usually accompanied within a week by the call from Cassandra. I'm not a stupid man. I'm a 63-year-old retired credit union manager. I knew the pattern. I just didn't want to know it. Then came the Tuesday in October with the voicemail about the HELOC payment. I called Warren back that afternoon, and he answered this time. "Hey, Dad." "Hi, son. I got your wife's message." "Yeah, it's just been a slow month. Contracts dried up a bit." "Warren," I stopped him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be straight with me." "Sure." "When's the last time you and Cassandra sat down and made a real budget? Like a written-out, line-item budget?" Silence. "We kind of know what things cost." "That's not what I asked." More silence. He said they'd been meaning to do it. Things had been busy. Cassandra had just started a new consulting project. I asked how much the consulting project paid. He said it was still in the early stages. I asked if it paid anything yet. He said it was more of a foundation building phase. I told him I wasn't going to transfer the $2,000. There was a pause. Then, "Oh, okay, no, yeah, I get it. We'll figure something out." He sounded like I'd taken something from him. Not angry, just deflated, like he'd reached for a light switch and the power was out. That feeling bothered me more than I expected. I called Gordon that night, told him what I'd done. He said good. Said it was 2 years overdue. I told him I felt terrible, and he said feelings weren't always accurate indicators of whether you'd done the right thing. That helped. A little. 4 days later, Cassandra called. Not a voicemail this time. A real call, which was unusual. I answered. Hi, so I just want to follow up on the transfer, because we really are in a tough spot, and the payment's going to be late, and that affects our credit score, which could be a problem if Warren needs to. Cassandra, I said. I told Warren I'm not sending it. Right, but he said you just kind of said it out of nowhere, and I thought maybe if you understood the full picture. I understand the full picture, I said. I've been looking at the full picture for 6 years. She went quiet, but different kind of quiet than Warren's. His was sheepish. Hers was calculating. I'm just not sure what you think is going to happen, she said finally. You want him to fall behind on his mortgage? I want him to figure it out, I said, like adults do. We have been figuring it out. With my money. She didn't have an answer to that. I said I loved my son and I wasn't interested in arguing, and I ended the call. The next 2 weeks were the quietest I'd had in years. No messages, no calls, no dinner invitations, nothing. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in November, I got a text from Warren. Not a call, a text, which was how I knew it wasn't going to be casual. Dad, me and Cassie got married last Saturday. Just a small ceremony, close friends. We didn't want a big deal. Just wanted to let you know. I sat in my kitchen for a very long time. I read the text twice, 3 times. Then I set the phone down on the counter and looked out at the crabapple trees. Small ceremony, close friends, last Saturday. I talked to my son 11 days before. He'd called me back after the voicemail situation. We'd had a whole conversation about budgets and contracts. He hadn't mentioned a wedding, not a date, not a plan, not a by the way. I picked up the phone and called Gordon. They got married, I said. He didn't say anything at first. When? Last Saturday. Another pause. Were you invited? No. He used a word he doesn't usually use. Gordon taught high school English for 35 years. He doesn't swear often, and when he does, you know the situation has moved past polite interpretation. I told him I wasn't sure how I felt. He said he thought I probably did know how I felt, and I just hadn't decided whether I was allowed to feel it yet. He was right, as usual. I called Warren the next morning. He answered on the second ring. Hey, Dad. Hi, son. I got your text. Yeah, I should have called. It just kind of happened fast, and we didn't want to make a big production of it. How many people were there? Pause. I mean, we had a little reception after. About 120, 130 people. I didn't say anything. It was at a venue near Liberty Village. Cassie has a lot of connections, so it came together quickly. 130 people, I said. Give or take. And I wasn't one of them. I could hear him breathing. Dad, it's not like that. Cassie's family is they have a different social circle. And we just wanted it to be people from that world it wasn't about. Warren, I said, I've given you approximately $240,000 over the last 6 years, and I wasn't invited to your wedding. He didn't say anything. I'm not asking for gratitude. I'm just asking you to understand what I'm looking at right now. His voice got quiet. I know, Dad. I'm sorry. I said I needed some time to think, and I meant it. I wasn't angry in the way I expected to be. I was tired. Deeply, bone-tired. The kind of tired where you realize you've been carrying something for a very long time, and you've been calling it love, when maybe some of it was just fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being unnecessary. I spent that weekend in Barrie, walking. just walking around the neighborhood, down by Kempenfeld Bay, through the park where Pauline and I used to take Warren when he was small and used to call every goose the loud duck. I thought about who I was before I became their financial backstop. I thought about what Pauline actually would have said. Not the version I'd been borrowing to justify the transfers, but the real Pauline, who'd grown up working 3 part-time jobs to put herself through Lakehead University, and who used to say that money given without expectation was a gift, but money given out of fear was a trap you built for yourself. She wouldn't have kept paying. I knew that. I'd always known that. I called a financial advisor I trusted, a woman named Janet who'd taken over my account after the colleague I'd worked with for years retired. I asked her to look at what I'd spent over 6 years in support of Warren and Cassandra. I already knew the number roughly. Seeing it documented in a table with dates made it real in a different way. Just over $240,000, including the down payment, the monthly contributions, the car repair I'd fronted, the dental work when Cassandra's benefits hadn't kicked in yet, the 2 months of groceries I'd covered when they'd come to visit and left with 3 bags I'd paid for. $240,000. Janet didn't say much. She's good that way. She asked me what I wanted to do going forward. I said I wanted to stop. She said that sounded like a plan. I called Gordon again, told him what the number was. He was quiet for a moment. "Doug," he said, "that's most of what Mom left you." It was. When our mother passed in 2014, she'd left us each a modest inheritance. Nothing dramatic, but meaningful. About $180,000 each after the estate was settled. I put mine into the retirement accounts and the duplex. And then, gradually, I'd moved it out in $2,000 increments into a Toronto condo where my son and his wife were eating at restaurants I'd never been invited to. That realization sat with me for about 3 days. I'm not a man who makes dramatic gestures. I'm not wired that way. But I am a man who, once he understands something clearly, tends to act on it clearly. I called Warren on a Wednesday morning and asked if he could come to Barrie on Saturday. He said he'd check with Cassandra. I said I'd like to see him, just him, if that was okay. There was a pause, and then he said, "Sure, okay." He arrived around noon. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. He'd lost a bit of weight. He came in, had a coffee, looked around the house with that slightly uncertain expression he gets when he doesn't know what the temperature of a room is going to be. I told him I loved him. I said that first because I meant it, and because I wanted him to understand everything else came from that place. Then I told him I was done. Not done with him, done with the arrangement. I told him I'd spent the better part of 6 years acting like his struggles were mine to fix, and that I'd been wrong. Not because I didn't love him, but because I'd confused helping with substituting. I'd substituted myself for the experiences that would have taught him what he needed to know. I said I should have stopped years ago, and that I was sorry I hadn't, because some of what had happened between us was something I'd made easier to happen by never making anything harder. He cried. My son cried, which I don't think I've seen since his mother's funeral. He said he knew things had been off. He said he felt like he'd been waiting for something to change, but he didn't know how to start it himself. I told him that was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. We talked for 4 hours. Real talking, the kind we hadn't done since he was maybe 20, before the money patterns calcified into something we both just accepted. He talked about feeling like he'd never caught up to where he was supposed to be. I talked about what it had cost me, not just financially. We talked about his mother, which we almost never do anymore, and he cried again when he said he thought she would have been disappointed in him. I told him she would have cried too, and then she would have told him to do better. He laughed, because that was exactly what she would have done. I told him about the duplex. I'd decided after the conversation with Janet and several nights of thinking it through that I was going to sell it. Not because I needed the money, the rental income was comfortable, but because having the asset meant having the buffer, and having the buffer meant I was always going to be tempted to use it. I needed to restructure things so that the temptation wasn't there. I also told him I was updating my will and that I was putting the bulk of it into a small family foundation, something Gordon and I were going to set up together, for bursaries at a college in Barrie where Pauline had once taught a continuing ed course. I told him there'd still be something for him. I wasn't cutting him out. I wasn't punishing him, but it would be structured, not liquid. He nodded. He looked relieved, which surprised me, like a man who'd been holding his breath. "Dad," he said before he left, "I don't know what's going to happen with me and Cassie." I said I couldn't speak to that. He nodded again, hugged me longer than he has in years, and got in his car. That was 4 months ago. Since then, I've heard from him twice. Both times he called himself, no prompt from Cassandra. Once to tell me he'd taken a staff position, not glamorous, IT support for a property management company in Scarborough, but steady benefits, pension contributions. The second time just to talk. 40 minutes about hockey and the weather, and a podcast he'd been listening to about Canadian history. He didn't ask for anything. Cassandra hasn't called. I don't know what's happening between them, and I've decided it's not mine to manage. I can't want his marriage to work harder than he does. I can't love him back to himself. That's his job. Gordon came down to Barrie last month, and we spent a weekend going through the paperwork for the foundation. We named it after Pauline's maiden name. It felt right. I'm sleeping better than I have in years. I go for walks by the bay most mornings. I'm thinking about taking a trip in the spring, somewhere I've never been, maybe the East Coast, the Cabot Trail, somewhere Pauline always wanted to go and we kept putting off. I'm 63 years old. I have enough. The crabapple trees are starting to bud again. I watch them from the kitchen in the mornings, and I think about how long they've been there, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, growing toward the light without anyone telling them how. I think that's what I needed to learn to do too. There's a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. I felt it the afternoon I sat in my kitchen in Barrie reading Warren's text for the 3rd time. We got married last Saturday, while the crabapple trees Pauline had planted stood perfectly still outside the window. That tiredness comes from finally seeing something clearly that you've been choosing not to see for a very long time. I spent 6 years telling myself I was being a good father, and in some ways I was. But there's a difference between being good and being useful, and I had confused the two so completely that I'd made Warren's life smaller without realizing it. Every transfer I made, every bill I covered, every time I answered Cassandra's calls without pushback, I was quietly telling my son that I didn't believe he could manage without me. That's not love. That's a slow erosion of someone's confidence, dressed up as generosity. What I understand now is that the consequences we live with aren't random. They follow from choices, and the choices I made early, to never say no, to smooth every difficulty before Warren had a chance to meet it, those choices had a direction. They led somewhere. They led to a 34-year-old man who didn't know how to make a budget. whose wife called his father the way you call a utility company, and who somewhere along the way had stopped believing in his own capacity to figure things out. I built that, not intentionally, but I built it. What I should have offered Warren, especially after his mother died, wasn't money. It was the harder thing: honest conversation, clear expectations, and the respect of believing he could handle difficulty. That's what actually builds a person. Not insulating them from consequences, but walking alongside them while they face those consequences and come out the other side with something real. The strength a person develops by working through hard things is the only kind that lasts. I had enough sense to know that when I was giving seminars to first-time homebuyers, I just couldn't apply it at home. The 4 hours Warren and I sat at my kitchen table in November were the most honest we'd been with each other in years. He cried. I probably should have too. But what struck me most was how relieved he looked when I told him things were changing. Like he'd been waiting for someone to stop the arrangement as much as I had. That told me everything. He didn't need the money. He needed me to believe he could live without it. Gordon told me once that integrity isn't what you do when things are easy. It's the decision you make when doing the right thing costs you something. Stopping cost me the comfortable illusion that I was needed. It cost me the version of fatherhood I'd been performing. But what I got back was a real conversation with my son, a clearer sense of who I am outside of that role, and mornings by the bay in Barrie that feel, for the first time in years, genuinely mine. I'm not sure Warren and Cassandra will make it. That's not in my hands. But I know my son took a staff job, called me twice with nothing to ask for, and laughed about hockey on the phone like we used to when he was young. That's worth more to me than any number I ever transferred.